Hi YouTube, welcome back to Wtf Rc Cars. So you've bought your new NB4 Plus. I'm going to run you through just the basics of what I would do as a minimum setting it up on your first RC. For me, I've got a few set up on this, so I'm going to start at model memory 3, but you can do whatever model memory you want. And it's just running you through a few things that you may or may not come across, you may not know about this type of radio, and it's more or less just a few hints and tips of setting it up for an RC so you've got the basic controls down and you know where you're going in menus to set things up. So let's bring you in for a close-up look, and hopefully this should make sense. So we've got our transmitter on, you've got your receiver fitted in your car, we've got the steering into channel 1, your ESC into channel 2. And when you buy these, your transmitter and receiver should be bound, but if you've bought a new receiver or anything, and for these any of the AF-DH3 receivers will work with this, just same as the Noble Pro and NB4. But first thing that I would do is go into menu, and you only really have to do this on one, or if you've updated the transmitter I would do it. But we can go into system and we can go to stick calibration, and then you want to turn your wheel both ways. Don't be alarmed if you've got red lines at the end. Pull the throttle, push the brake, and you can see it's got more travel forward than it has brake. These red lines, you will see that every time you run this calibration, and it's just telling the radio what is 100% throttle, brake, left and right on your steering. Then when you back out of it,
calibration successful.
You'll get the calibration successful. So what I like to do is, if I go into model, select the model you're going to be using. So on this, I'm going to be using 3. But you can use any you want, you can overwrite a channel. But once I've gone into the channel, the first thing I'll do, because I test so many different RCs and everything, just so I know I'm not getting anything crazy sort of results because of a mix that's set up or anything, I'll reset the model. So next thing, once we've reset the model, you can go into model name. And this is a lot easier when you're looking down on the controller. I'm doing it from the side. But then you just press enter. So we've got as name Optima Mid. Channel number definition you want on 4. Now, I knew this was set on channel 4, but usually when you change this, it'll reset it. So if you want ultra low latency, you can go 2 channel. I'm going to use this on 4 channel because it's absolutely fine. Even my race cars I use on 4 channel. If you want to go ultra low latency, you can go 2 channel, but then you lose the other 2 channels. And sometimes I like to plug lighting kits in and things to test stuff. Next, customize main menu. So on this, you only actually want stuff showing on your menu that are relevant to the vehicle you're using. So for me, I may use timer, I may use the assign menu. Name is to name the channels, model is for your models. Sensors, if you're not using sensors, which I won't be on this one, you can turn that off. Mixers I won't be using, I can turn that off. ABS I won't be using, I can turn that off. I don't need to change my throttle mid, I don't need to change my throttle neutral. Idle up I won't be using, engine cut I won't be using, cruise control no, boat mode no, SVC no, trainer mode no, won't be using iBus 2, don't need help. So you can greatly declutter your actual screen by turning all the options off that aren't actually going to be relevant to it. Throttle curve I'm not bothered about on this model. Channel speed I won't be using. And you can reorganize these by using the up-down menu, but I don't really mind where they are. I just want to declutter my actual main menu. So if we then come out and come out of that, next we need to make sure that our receiver is updated and will match as transmitter. So for this, let's power it up, and then we can go into RX set. We can come down, and bear in mind they don't need to be bound to it. So we've got an FGR4B, so we can put it on that. Then we're going to press and hold the bind button on the actual receiver and power on, and we're going to keep this held until the flashing changes on the receiver. So at the moment it's flashing really quick. I don't know if you'll see that, and now the flash pattern has changed. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to get that on camera. There, you should be able to see it. So you get 3 slow flashes and then a pause, rather than the very quick constant blinking. Then we go into update. We've got as FGR4B selected. And what this will do, it will look for any receiver that is in the update mode. So make sure you only do this one at a time. And basically all that does, it makes sure your receiver is on a matching firmware to the actual transmitter. It does save a lot of weird problems. So then you power off your receiver, and we can back out of this menu. Then we go RX set, bind set, make sure it's enhanced, make sure a start channel is steering, and then set it to bind. Then you want to quickly press and hold your bind button, turn it on, and then let go, and you'll see it's bound up. Now at this point, if we back out and look at his menu, we've got no extra menus. We've just got the actual menus that are relevant to this RC. You don't want to see boat mode, trainer mode and everything else if you're not using it. The name function is useful for naming your auxiliary channels. I'll cover that in another video. Your timer function, that may be somewhat relevant if you want to time your laps or time. What I use it for is practicing. Most races are 5 minutes, so I'll set a timer up to 5 minutes. So if we're looking here, you can have up timer, down timer, set it to 5 minutes. You can change that. You can change your seconds. You can set this so it will start on throttle, but I tend not to use that. It's useful sometimes, but if you turn this option on, as soon as you hit throttle, it'll start counting down. So once we've got that set, now we want to have a look for a steering. So if we look at this, one of the endpoints is a bit far out, and if I switch the RC around so it makes more sense for you guys, at least you'll see what I'm doing here. So when we turn this way, the wheels should turn that way at the front, and they're not. When we turn this way, it should come to this side, to the right. So as channel needs reversing for our steering, so we're going to go into menu, we're going to go reverse, steering, reverse. And you want to make sure these are set perfect before you start messing with endpoints and everything. So now as steering turns the correct way, then we move on to throttle. So throttle, brake and reverse, that's all set up correctly. So next we're going to want to set our trim for his throttle, for his steering, sorry. And this looks pretty much bang on as it is, but if your wheels were slightly off to one side, you've got your 2 trims here. Your bottom one is set up for steering, top one is set up for throttle trim. So your throttle trim, because you've reset it, is on 0. And what this one does, if you move the trim to negative, it'll move it one way. If you move your trim positive, it'll move your wheels the other way. It'll tell you when you're at your centre point. And if you're in the sub trim, so what you can do, you can look for what number this is. So if we needed to get it straight, if we needed a sub trim on 10, you can then look in your steering and we can change the actual sub trim instead of the trim. So you can use that to trim your wheels, and if you do it that way, your actual steering trim will stay 0. So just to sort of clarify, your sub trim will not show up on anywhere other than your sub trim menus. So if I move this to an extreme, and then if we back out, we can see a steering is still showing 0. So your sub trim is used to set your actual sort of steering in a straight line without affecting what's on your screen, because when you're running and you move your trim, this will show on your screen. So you can see straight away how much you've got it moved left or right. And then when you've finished, you can come back to your sub trim and you can correct it. So on this RC, because of the way I built it and zeroed everything, 0 trim is pretty much absolutely bang on. Ideally, you want to set your servo correctly and use your steering bars to set your, like your turnbuckles and everything, to set your actual steering. But sometimes if you're out with your RC and you notice it's pulling over a little bit, what you can do is, if it were pulling a little bit to the left, you can move your sub trim across to right to correct it, and then at a later date you can correct it with your steering and bring it back. Or you can go into your sub trim and you can correct it on there. Exactly the same for your throttle or any other channels. But just a few things I do to set the car perfect, because I like as channel 1 to be 0. If you're having to notch your sub trim, your actual trim up, then this is going to show 4% all the time when you're driving. And just my OCD, I like them set at 0. And it just helps you set up your RC basically. So next thing, you want to set your endpoints. So if we look, if we turn it this way, the servo pretty much stops at the end of the travel. If we turn it left, there's a little bit of movement on this servo and it just pulls that wheel in. So we can go into as menus, we can go into endpoint, we can turn it left, and then you can back this down. And it's one of the reasons, especially cheaper servos burn out. So basically, you're listening for the sound of your servo and you don't want it to still be pulling. Once it's at 100% of your steering, you want the servo to stop trying to pull the steering further. Now, another way to see it is if you've got a servo saver on an RC, you'll see if the servo saver's set like that and then it gets so far and then pulls and it's pulling on the spring, then you know your servo is trying to turn further than the actual physical throw of the RC. But once you've got it right, you should have nice swift steering, and then if you do hold it at 100%, that servo is not trying to pull the whole steering even further. Especially like on this one where we've got the metal hubs and everything, there's not really any give in anything. So other than the servo saver, your servo is going to be constantly straining. So it does improve the life of your servo, it'll improve the life of your RC. Some RCs will have bump stops, so you can set your endpoints so it's just off the bump stop, and then you know it's not pulling on it. The throttle, tend to leave at 100% and brake at 100%, and then depending on what ESC you have, you'll have a calibration mode on your ESC. So you'll put it into calibration mode, give it full throttle, back off, brake, back off, and set your center point. Different ways of doing it for different ESCs. But if you leave your control at 100%, calibrate your ESC. Then if you want to limit your throttle, you can go into the endpoint adjustment and you can back your throttle to down to say 50%, and then you've only got half the speed. Just gives you a lot more options that way. A few of the other things I like to set up. So if we look at assignment, so if we look on here, so for TR3, I generally like to set this to be the steering dual rate. So I like to have the dual rate set, and then if you just tap it and then move it down to 1, and then the direction, I usually find this works better reversed. So if we then move the TR3, we can back as dual rate of a steering down, and if I go to the extreme so you can see the effects of this, so if we turn this right down to say 20%, full lock is only 20% both directions, so it effectively reduces both your endpoints at once. So if I then turn this up, you can see we've now got more steering in both directions. Now, what I find this useful for, especially in racing, if you find that you've got far too much steering and your car's switching ends because you're hitting a corner, going 100%, it's too much steering, a quick way to sort of alleviate that is to back your dual rates down a little bit, so you're not steering as harsh or at such an aggressive angle when you're turning. So it is really useful to have dual rate for your steering on a button that you can assign. Also, if you're driving bashers, you'll then see that if you turn 100% and your car rolls over and it's getting really annoying and you're having to remember not to turn as much, you can back your dual rate down and it stops your RC flipping. You don't turn as rapid, but if turning rapid's going to roll your car over every time, you're better off backing your dual rates down. And if we look on the screen, I have the dual rate set on here, and it's easy to change these. You just tap on it and then you tap any one of these and change it to what you like. So I have race timer and then your forward and brake dual rates. But other things that I like to set up, so if we then go to assign on SW1, I like to assign this, and I have this one set to timer stop, start and reset. So if we then come out, if you press it, you get your timer countdown started and off you go. If you press it once, it'll stop. Press it again, it'll carry on. If you press and hold it, it'll reset your timer. And for racing practice, I just find it brilliant. You've got 5 minutes, it will count you down and it will tell you when it's finished. Other things that I like to set, so depending on what track you're on, you might not need the full speed of your throttle going forward. So on this, you can set your throttle dual rate. So if you click that, turn it down to 1 and then reverse. If we come out now, so if I move the dial, which is the TR4 we've got this assigned to, so if I back that down, it backs down the maximum throttle and you can see it reducing on here. So again, just extremes to show you what it does. If we back it down to 20% and I hit 100% throttle, you only get 20%, and as you roll it on, you get more. So in racing, you may find your pinion and spur choice is just a little too hot for the back straight, your longest straight, and you're just having to remember to back off the throttle a little bit, or your RC's running a bit hot and you just need to back it off quick, you ain't got time to change it, you can just back down your throttle dual rate. Also, if you've got a bashing RC and you want to let a younger driver have a go and they're a bit inexperienced, you can roll this all the way down to say 50%. And then they've only got 50% at throttle, and it's really easy to put it back. You can also do the same with your brake. You can assign that to one of the dials on the side, and you can switch around these dials depending on which you use more or less. You can also assign it to the top hats. It's very configurable, these controllers. So brake, if we wanted to assign that, we can go to, say, VR1. We can go on here. Then we can go to brake dual rate. Back out of that. And then as variable dial, so we're now using this, but your variable dial, you can back the brakes off. It will tell you when it's at 50. And this is why I say if you calibrate the brake and throttle at 100% with your ESC, you've then got full control on these. So if your brake was too much, you can back down the dual rate and that'll back down your braking. On most ESCs, you will get to a point where you back this down and then your brake stops functioning and it's not always 0. That purely depends on the ESC itself. Again, ideally, you'd change your brake setting on your ESC, but some ESCs don't have that ability. Some only have a few steps that they can assign to. But if you're actual mid-race and you find your car's braking way too hard, it's just handy to be able to have a dial that you can just back down and you can see the position on the screen. I think on most it will also affect the reverse. So if we back it down to 50, yeah, if we put it at 0, we got no brake or reverse. So on this ESC, it's pretty much got a single stage reverse, looking at it. So not a lot will affect it. But you can see as the numbers come down, it does back off the reverse. But it will affect the braking. More useful in racing because you don't tend to use reverse on anything. But yeah, it's just a way of giving you a bit more control on the fly of your actual radio, of your actual RC, how it drives, some of its characteristics. The dual rate on the steering will definitely come in for a lot of people, especially if you're having problems with your short course truck rolling over on every corner. It's usually because they do turn quite tight. Certainly with most of the race cars, almost every one of the guys that race will use dual rate during a race. Definitely works well on changing track conditions. So if you're racing outdoors and you've got a difference in weather or track temperature, or indoors, especially where tracks are using additives on the on-road cars, you notice the track grip level come up, and as the night progresses, it's sometimes handy on the steering dual rates to be able to back it down so you're not turning too tight. It is amazing how much a track changes in the space of, say, 3 qualifiers and a final. But yeah, that covers most of it. On the sensor panel, you can choose what sensors you display. On this one, we're not running any, so the RX voltage will read the BEC provided to the receiver. So your ESC output to the receiver will show as your RX voltage. Your TX voltage is your transmitter battery, and then you've just got signal strength and everything. If you did wire in the battery voltage monitor cable, you can wire that directly to the battery feed from ESC, or you can put it into the balance lead. They do fit quite well. They do just plug straight in, and it's a very convenient way of doing it. You can choose to display whatever sensors you want. So if you were interested in that, you can have that voltage showing. But it's just a quick sort of overview. Yeah, I know none of my videos end up being quick, but I try and cover most of it. But it's just a basic settings of just a sanity check, really, to see what's going to be convenient for you, what will be a good way of setting up either your new receiver or maybe the receiver you've got with it for whatever reason isn't bound, and just checking that it's updated. It stops a lot of weird issues that you can run into. I mean, me specifically, I had one where I'd upgraded quite a few firmwares on a lot of my radios. I then bound it to a transmitter that would bind, but I'd forgot to update the receiver in one of my cars, and I had a hell of a time trying to work out why it had done 3 or 4 laps, then slow down to 50%, then just stop. And if you turn the ESC off and back on, off it went again for another 3-4 laps. It ended up being the firmware on the actual receiver. As soon as I updated it, worked absolutely perfect. And it's just because it's an RC that I'd not run for a couple of years, and I'd updated most of my transmitters multiple times since then. So although it had bind, it was out of step, and that's what was causing problems. Just a few other settings to check. You can change your wallpaper and everything. So one of the other things to check is your interface protocol. You want it all on PWM unless you're using iBus or anything. And then the servo frequency. If you set all channels, it'll do your throttle and your ESC, and the other 2 channels all same. Or if you purposely know your steering servo needs a set frequency, 380 should cover most, but you have got the choice of 833, 1000. You can go analog, and a dead giveaway is if you've got a really old servo and it's twitching constantly because it's on 380, drop it down to analog. That'll sort that out for you. Or if you know the actual refresh rate of your servo, it's usually in hertz. I know a lot of popular ones on market are 333. So if you want to match it exactly, you can go on to custom, and you can set that to 333 hertz. For me, most of mine work absolutely fine on digital, and I leave it set to all channels. So you can go into failsafe, and basically if you're running an electric RC, this is pretty much how you want to leave it. Just leave it all set to free. And then if you're running the RC and you lose power, it will just cut off and your car will just stop. It'll just roll to a halt. If you're running a nitro, then you may want to set your throttle to slight brake, but I'll cover that in another video. But yeah, on the failsafe, if you want to see what happens if you lose signal, so you can be driving, if you press and hold that, that'll show you what happens if you cut off. So if we're driving, you lose signal, that turns RF off. As soon as you touch throttle again, it'll come back on. But it's just a way of you testing what had happened. So if we were driving and so we're steering, press and hold that, it'll simulate no RF.
Signal lost.
And you see the steering just stayed where it were.
Signal lost.
So no throttle, no steering. As soon as you let that off, it comes back and takes back over. Obviously, if you're driving and you lose signal, your ESC should just stop. And then when it comes back, you can carry on again. But yeah, I just thought I'd run through a video showing a very basic setup of the RC, showing you how to make sure your receiver's bound properly, updated properly to match the actual transmitter. and just a few steps on finding things like dual rate and your endpoints, your sub trims, and explain what they do. So let's wrap this one up. So there we have it, a probably not so quick but quite thorough setup guide of how to do your endpoints, reverse servos, failsafe, and pretty much just the basics to help you have a much easier start of using your new NB4 Plus. And if you follow this, it seems like it's complicated, but once you get used to it, you've got most of your settings that you need. You've got none of the clutter on your menu screen that you don't need. You can always go back into that menu and add ones back if you find you do need them. Or you may want to take even more of the options off if you don't want to use your dual rate or anything like that. And it just makes it easier to use the controller if you've not got to slide through menu screens of stuff you don't want. Depending on how complicated your RC is in your setup, you might want a lot more of them, you might want less. But hopefully that puts you in a sort of good footing for how to set up this controller and eliminates you running into some problems or stressing over why your steering's going wrong way or your throttle, because you can reverse them as well. But thanks again for watching Wtf Rc Cars. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, share to friends and family, and catch you guys again in the next one.